The quarantine dome didn't just shake. It trembled like a living animal trying to climb out of its own skin. Ceiling ribs thrummed, the observation glass quivered, and the floor sent a fine rattle up through every bolt, as if the whole structure were a drum stretched too tight. In the center, the young dragon pressed his back to a curved wall and hammered one wing against it in ragged pulses, breath shearing the air into white fans. Bronze and black, all edges and terror. He flared his crest at phantoms only he could see. His pupils were narrow, black needles spun by fear. His chest climbed too fast for the oxygen his body could reasonably ask the world to give. Naya Korin stood alone at the window and let the first surge pass without touching a single button. The intercom lay under her hand, alive with its sterile echo, and she switched it off. Electronics made panic echo back at itself. She had learned that in tunnels where the rock kept every scream on file. She smoothed her palms down the sides of her tunic the way she would smooth linens at a hospice bed, then breathed in until her ribs spread and her throat could hold a note without tremor. When she sang, it wasn't the clean, doctored cadence the clinics taught in tidy rooms. It was a canyon song, her mother's miner's hymn, vowels round as river stones, consonants softened by dust and grief. The melody moved as water does when it finds a ledge, gently, insistently, in a voice older than instructions. The dragon slammed his wing again. The glass shivered. Alarms on the console begged to be important. Naya did not raise her volume to compete. She narrowed it, kept it low and close. A human chest as instrument. The note rolled across the glass and through the seams of the door into the room where he drowned. And it gave his panic something to lean on besides itself. She kept the pulse steady and made her breath an invitation. 3 measures in, she let the song open a little. Not higher, never. Higher with creatures who live by pressure but wider, so the sound could carry warmth instead of weight. On the mezzanine above, a small escort of palace-grade security held a professional stillness that frayed at the edges. Between them stood a tall man in a plain gray coat, too fine to be anything but deliberate, collar unmarked, hands folded at his back. The dome's light washed his face to stone. And still the exhaustion behind his eyes was unmistakable. No medallion, no crown. Only a gaze that did not move from the dragon's racing chest. When one of the guards leaned in and whispered, "Your Majesty," the man answered with a minute shake of his head and never took his eyes off the floor, where Naya now laid her palm, flat and bare, as if reminding the room that flesh exists. Kythor, the tag on the chart, said the name in clipped administrative glyphs reared, tail lashing so hard it scored sparks from the glossed concrete. Naya shifted her stance, turning a shoulder to present less threat. She continued the song as if the blow she might receive were merely weather. Sound pooled in the dome's concavity and returned to her gentled. And for a thin, crucial second, the young dragon listened. The tremor in his ribcage skipped, then hitched again, wild. His nostrils flared, and there, under the chemical tang of disinfectant and the ozone bite of scrubbers, he found the simple animal scent of a human who had walked into fear without armor. She shaped the next phrase with the care of setting a bone. Her voice dipped under the frequency of the vent huff and the light buzz, found the note that slipped past machinery and went straight to lungs. "Easy, little storm," she said between bars, too soft for the mezzanine, just right for the floor. The dragon froze at the word storm, because in his language, that was also a word for mother. And then the panic shuddered through him again like a machine trying to restart and burning itself. Naya, let him. She didn't fight the wave. She met it with measures and breath, gave his fear a rhythm at least as consistent as its own. He struck the wall one more time, weaker, and Naya took that gift as permission. She stepped to the airlock, keyed the manual latch, and took 2 breaths while the cycle hissed around her. They were not for courage. They were to make sure the note she would carry into the room belonged to patience, not adrenaline. The doors parted. Heat hit her face like an opened oven. The dragon's head swung, teeth bright as new metal. She sang anyway. On the balcony, the man in gray let his folded hands unfurl, flexed his fingers once as if shaking off a tremor of his own, and still silent, watched the door refuse to protect the woman he had never expected to need. The air in the dome tasted wrong. And Naya filed the thought for later. Disinfectant sharp as acid fog. Recirc fans pitched just high enough to scratch a nervous system raw. Lights at a surgical white. That flattened depth into glare. But later is only useful if you win now. She didn't advance as if to tame. She settled as if to anchor, keeping her shoulders low, her hands visible, allowing the dragon to be the only thing in the world here, permitted grandeur. Kythor's panic scattered like birds in a blast wave, one flock taking to his tail, one to his wings, another shivering the long muscles along his spine. He tried to bite the air into shapes that made sense, and found none. His pupils stabbed down to pinpoints, then blew wide in a lurching attempt at threat assessment. Naya let his fear do what it does, hunt for exits, and quietly offered him a different one. She changed the shape of the melody so it would sit under his breath and not on top of it, then unspooled a simple instruction between tones. In, she said on an intake. Out, she said on a falling note. Her chest a metronome made of ribs and nerve. He didn't know. Words, not like that, not under the siren hiss of ancient memory. He knew pulse. On the third cycle, his inhale matched hers by accident, and on the fourth by choice, a thin, desperate mimicry that snagged on a cough. She shortened the phrase until success was all but guaranteed. 2 heartbeats in, 2 out. No pride required. His tail clipped her shoulder, as his body remembered it had mass. Pain flared under her collarbone, bright and mean, and she kept the line of the notes smooth so his next breath wouldn't borrow her wince. There, she told him, and because her voice held, his chest did. Claws as long as her forearm hovered at her throat. The hand was shakes and intent, and 1,000 evolutionary promises concentrated to a point. She did not freeze. She lifted her chin the way she had for children whose terror had needed to be seen before it could be soothed. She brought the song down to almost nothing, and let her breathing carry the rest. Air moved between them, warm against, warm. Slowly, like a winter river, deciding to admit spring, the talons lowered and found the floor, and the friction hiss they made, replacing her pulse in his ear, became part of the rhythm instead of proof of threat. Naya edged the environment toward him without taking a step. She thumbed the clip at her belt that altered the glass tint, and let the room's color slide from surgical white into amber dawn. The glare backed off his retinas, and depth returned to the world. She coaxed one vent to turn its fan blade speed down, until the pitch dropped under the comfort line she'd learned listening to 100 ventilators refuse to frighten their patients any more than necessary. The scent would need scrubbing from policy, not air later, but already the acid prickle eased. Kythor's chest hitched again, and then found her count and stayed with it for 2 full measures. For a creature born into flight, he looked at her like air had finally introduced itself. Kythor, she ventured, shaping the name without the clipped edges the chart had. He flinched at the first syllable, not because he recognized the sound, but because names often arrive with commands. She softened it at once into melody, so the name became a place to rest in. Kythor. Breathe. His head tipped, crest flattening a fraction. He gave her one hard stare, the fierce, unblinking audit of a mind deciding whether to live, and then he inhaled when she did, and exhaled when she asked, as if the room had finally been taught how to be a room. Above, unseen, the man in gray leaned on the rail and rediscovered the primitive, humiliating act of breathing with strangers. The guard to his right began a report he did not finish. The Emperor, though the word was nowhere yet in the air, watched a human woman step close enough to put her palm to the hinge of his son's jaw, and felt the noise in his own chest settle as if her hand had reached backward through time and closed, something that had been left open much too long. Kythor's tremors cycled once more. Smaller now, like aftershocks remembering who is in charge. Naya matched them with tiny adjustments, building a scaffolding he could climb down panic by panic. She did not stroke, did not pet. Contact would be its own conversation later. She simply left her hand where a living pulse met hers. After a while, the breaths came so regularly that even the monitors, those mechanical gossips, began to believe the story. She didn't reward the room with silence. That is a trick panic plays. It begs for quiet and calls it peace when it's only the absence of sound to resist. She kept the song soft, scaled to comfort, not dominance, and let it earn its way smaller until what remained was a hum you felt in bone before ear. The dragon's eyelids lowered to half. A line of saliva that had strung between his teeth snapped and fell. The body's small signature that the threat economy had shifted back below, poverty line. Only then did she shift her stance to sit, slow and obvious. So her height would never again remind him of the white lights and rubber hands that had turned care into an exam. She folded herself onto the warmed floor and hummed to the cadence of his breath. And the dome, the trembling, over-bright, over-loud, over-sanitized dome, learned, one small interval at a time, how to be kind. There is a moment in every panic where the body tests mercy with teeth. It came as a flicker across Kythor's lips, an involuntary bearing, not a promise of harm so much as a question sharpened by evolution. The young dragon's muzzle dipped. A triangle of shadow slid over Naya's collarbones. She did not lean away. She did something ruder and more intimate. She offered the truth of her pulse. One hand stayed where it was at the hinge of his jaw, steady as a village well. With the other, she reached to her belt and pulled free a rolled band of woven medcloth, the kind hospitals used, to wrap damaged ribs. She looped it across her palm and let it hang, soft and obvious, between his teeth and her throat. "If you must hold," she murmured, the melody barely a breath now. "Hold this." He took it as a starving mind takes a reasonable substitute. Incisors found cloth. The tug was strong enough to drag a smaller woman forward. Naya set her stance and gave him inch enough to satisfy the reflex, but not enough to tear the anchor out of herself. The pressure steadied. It was not a bite. It was a tether. The tremor that ran along his jaw eased as tendon and memory found a task they could finish. She felt his breath climb the fabric to her palm, hot and damp, and let the song widen in her chest until it could carry both of them without breaking. Behind the glass, the sedatives woke up on a tray. A medtech who had slept badly pressed a thumbprint to authorization, and an injector arm pivoted toward the airlock with that sterile cheerfulness devices use when they don't understand stakes. Naya did not turn. She did not look. She said into the floor, "If you flood him now, you teach the room to panic again in 6 hours." Her voice was not loud, merely certain, the confident cruelty of a good fact. On the mezzanine, the tall man in gray lifted 2 fingers. The injector froze so fast, its servos whined. "Stand down." A guard relayed, voice clipped. "Professional." The man said nothing else. He did not need to. Naya felt the room's intent shift the way a ship feels, wind changing its mind. Kythor's pupils, those needle-thin slits, began to breathe again, pinching, widening, not stuck anymore on the single setting of catastrophe. The cloth grew wet at the edges where heat and saliva made an alliance. She twisted it once so fresh weave met tooth. His crest lowered a finger's breadth. The rumble under his tongue changed key from danger to doubt. Doubt is the friend of trust. Doubt asks what else could be true. "Let's try a new math," she said softly, and introduced the first pattern she ever taught any patient. A count that belonged more to bodies than to clocks. 2 for in, she hummed. 2 for out, a phrase that could be sung with a closed mouth. A rhythm that could slip under any species' ribs. She matched him through 3 cycles, then 4, not judging the hiccups, adjusting the tempo when his breath tried to run faster than hands could hold. When he missed, she shortened the measure again, turned the task into something a frightened child could pass. The claw that had hovered at her throat came down. Nails rasping the floor with a sound like flint making friends with steel. The great head did the smallest, bravest thing. It leaned. She took the tilt on her forearm like weightlifting in a church. The song's vowel widened. Consonants softened until they were only scaffolding for air. His jaw unlatched, the medcloth sagged, and for a single heartbeat the bare curve of his teeth fit against the bare curve of her wrist, with the precision of an omen that had chosen a better meaning. "Good," she breathed, making the word itself a long, unbroken tone he could rest on. Her fingers found the thick muscle that ran from eye ridge to corner of mouth, and rubbed in slow, firm circles that told nerve endings a story about safety. He shivered once. A full-body quake that might have been the last thunder of the departing storm, and then he sank to a crouch with his flank against her flank, and this she had not expected, so soon allowed his tail to curl around her calves like a sash. The heat of him took up the space where fear had been. The room, remembering its lines, tried to intrude. A maintenance drone, punctual as guilt, descended along its cleaning track and hissed a ribbon of sanitizer into the air with the innocent malice of protocol. Kythor's eyes blew wide, every muscle barked alarm, and the predator's decision came: fight or flee and fail. Naya didn't let the spike bloom. She cut the melody entirely for one ruthless second and replaced it with her own body's volume, no, sharp as a snapped thread. The drone paused as if surprised a human would address it. Her hand found the override on her belt. The drone's light died with a penitent chirp, and the stream cut to steam. "Ghost," she told Kythor, tapping the drone's dark lens and then her own chest. "Gone." She brought the song back, but she did not hurry it. She let him sniff the air and confirm her lie about ghosts. He blinked, a slow, double eyelid closing like a curtain on bad theater. The panic that had been a wall became a door. Something loosened on the balcony. A guard's boot creaked. The man in Gray's shoulders stoned since the first slam against the glass dropped the distance of a long night. He had not yet said his name to the room. Names can be dangerous when rooms are listening, but his silence no longer had the edge of a blade. It sounded more like a prayer trying to remember its words as the liturgy changed. She stood, telegraphing the rise, and Kythor flowed up with her, wary but not whipped, his body mapping hers for balance. Together they made a circuit of the perimeter at a patient shuffle. Every step that did not trigger a trapdoor in his memory wrote scar tissue into something more like muscle. Every pause, she breathed. Every breath, he followed. When they finished the lap without catastrophe, she made the oldest joke in hospice, the one about work and wages. "Payment due," she murmured, and fetched from her pocket the smallest of contraband, a ceramic ball impregnated with salt and trace iron, a miner's hand therapy aid she'd kept from the tunnels. She rolled it along the floor with the toe of her boot. It made a quiet clack, like river stone on stone. Kythor's ear frills twitched. He nudged it with his snout. Once, twice, then again, and the tiniest of chuffs left his chest. Not quite a laugh, but something that knew where laughter lived. He napped with his chin on her boot, while the cloth dried in her fist. That was the first trust any of them saw that day. And it had teeth marks in it. Most good trusts do. Panic isn't only a visitor. It's a bad architect. The dome had been built to be clean first and kind second, and every surface wore that priority like a smirk. Naya set about redrawing the blueprints the way a field surgeon sets a fracture. Gently, quickly, and with enough authority that the body believes you. She began with sound. Always sound. The fans purred a pitch and a half too high, a mosquito whine humans could ignore and dragons could not. She dug into the vent control with the illegal admin string. Every nurse knows, and no administrator admits exists, dropped the blade speed, and shifted the frequency under the comfort threshold she carried in her head like a hymn. The air ceased to be a needle. Light next. White light lies to the nervous system. It says noon forever. She dragged the color temperature down until the edges of things stopped shouting, and depth returned to the room. The panels blushed from surgery theater to canyon dawn. Shadows became places to rest the eyes, instead of theaters of ambush. Kythor's pupils unknotted, his crest smoothed. He watched her without bracing for an invisible impact. Scent mattered most, and would be the hardest. The disinfectant's sharp ghost had colonized the dome. A chemical memory of old fogs and worse nights. She called down to stores with the authority of someone ordering blankets after a mining collapse and got a crate of neutral filters that were supposed to be earmarked for executive spas. She installed them at the intake and ordered a no-spray protocol for this pod under the pretext of conducting a non-volatile sensitivity assay. Bureaucracy likes three-word phrases. She paired the absence of mana, no CE, stink with the presence of something that wasn't threat. A steaming bowl of mineral water, laced with a single crumble of basalt she kept from her canyon childhood. Basalt doesn't smell like anything to most species. To hers and, apparently to his, it carries the memory of rain that meant harvest, not flood. Cathor inhaled, once, long, and his ribcage did the unteachable. It remembered enough. The biodata monitor's blessed gossips chirped and beeped in polite hysteria every time his heart made a decision. She muted them to a soft visual glide and let one small chime ring only if numbers aimed at catastrophe. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was honest. Inside it, the dragon's breath and Naya's low hum carved a shared corridor through which anything real could move. Every radiant surface taught fear the same lesson: reflect or die. She pulled privacy films from a drawer labeled visitors and skinned the glass with a translucent amber that turned watching into warm blur. On the mezzanine, the guards became shapes that could be water or wind when seen through the film. Useful shapes, not threats. The man in gray, his jaw scrubbed of official profile by the glaze, raised no protest. If anything, the set of his shoulders offered permission for work neither of them would put on paper yet. She gave Cathor a floor that knew what floors are for. The polished concrete read as pond ice to a creature who had fallen through enough times to keep counting. She fetched a coil of thermal matting from the disaster kit and rolled it out in a curve that made a nest by implication. When he stepped on it, the mat did the social grace of being warm without announcing itself. He did not flinch. He circled once, twice, the way species do when the earth is checking their reasons, and lay with the sigh that has the same translation everywhere. Not dying now. The men upstairs were learning something too. When a junior guard tried to hand a report pad to the tall man, the man simply flattened his hand above it and let the pad rest there, in held suspension, as if paperwork could wait on breath. He watched as Naya slid the injector arm back into the wall and used the empty space for something more valuable. A wide basin of water, not too deep to drown in, but deep enough to reflect a dragon's face without bending it into a stranger. Cathor peered over the rim, flinched at his own eyes, then carefully, as if making an apology, touched the surface with the tip of his tongue. Ripples turned terror into geometry. He watched them settle. He did too. Only when the room had changed its mind did she speak the first word that wasn't instruction or prayer. Again, she said, turning the hum back into account. 2 for in, 2 for out. She added a hand gesture, a slow opening and closing of her fingers that his peripheral vision could catch without being bossed by. He matched the shapes, more curious now than hunted, as he breathed. She mapped his tremor triggers, like a cartographer crossing a marsh, marking the quicksand and the hummocks she could rely on. His left ear frill twitched at high-pitched whines. She dialed the medbay's other machines down until their chatter sounded like polite conversation at the far end of a long room. His eyes dilated at sudden brightness. She set the panel transitions to glide instead of jump. His tail thumped once at the distant bark of a training drone. She sent a message to security that the East Corridor would be conducting sensor drift calibration and to please take their toys elsewhere. The door sighed. 2 officials in soft shoes and hard expressions came to tally liabilities and assign blame. They brought with them that pleasant, dangerous attitude of people whose salaries believe in sedatives, Naya did not stand. She was sitting with a dragon, and that is a rank. He needs a person, one began, voice dry as ration crackers. He needs protocols. The other finished, not looking at Kythor at all. Naya turned her face up to them and used tone the way a surgeon uses a scalpel. Protocols instructed this room to shout, she said. He needed it to whisper. The person made that happen. You can write me up after his heart learns not to sprint at shadows. She nodded toward the mezzanine, where the blur shaped like a man had not moved in many minutes. Or you can find the authority to let me keep him alive without making him pay for it later. Silence gathered its robe and sat down with them. On the balcony, the gray figure's hand lifted a fraction. Not quite a command. Not quite a blessing. The officials found sudden interest in the color of the privacy film and retreated with the bureaucrat's favorite verb, later. Kythor's jaw worked, not in threat now, but in the awkward learning of a different reflex. He made a sound like a stone rolling down a riverbed and caught it, embarrassed. Naya smiled, without showing teeth. That, she said, as if awarding a medal, is a good noise. She met it with a human equivalent, a low, friendly click she had heard from canyon lizards on hot nights and used to coax wary children from under bunks. Kythor answered with a smaller version. And then, in a gesture that did more for this empire than any parade, he slid his muzzle along the mat until it rested lightly across her shins. The weight said, I will try. The hum in her chest said, I am staying. By the time the amber panels simulated afternoon, the dome no longer felt like a machine that punished biology for being noisy. It felt, if not like a den, then like a room with the manners of one. Naya logged nothing of the important parts and everything that would satisfy audits, filtration changes, light levels, incident times. She annotated the chart with a line that would look like an error to anyone who hadn't been there to hear it. Patient responded to canyon tone vocalization, continue. The man in gray read that line through the blur and, for the first time since dawn, let his eyes close long enough to turn one breath into two. When she finally stood, stiff-kneed and quietly victorious, Kythor lifted his head, but did not panic at the change. He followed her hand signal and breathed where she breathed, as if trust had been upgraded from an accident to a habit. The maintenance drone stayed dead on its rail like a bad idea taking a nap. The fans made a sound you could forget on purpose. The dome had learned a new grammar. Tomorrow, she told him, because hope does best with an appointment. We'll walk while the lights change. We'll teach your body what color means when it isn't danger. She gathered the damp ribbon of medcloth, the basalt bowl, the notations, and the ache in her shoulder, and turned once toward the mezzanine. The blur of the man had not left. He had, however, leaned forward the smallest degree, the way fathers do, when bedtime finally becomes sleep, and there is nothing left to do but listen to the breathing you would give your life to keep regular. The first blast was not a clean concussion but a crooked punch, the kind of explosion you get when impatience meets borrowed explosives and a floor plan downloaded from rumor. It bucked the dome from underneath, threw dust out of vents that were supposed to exhale sterility, and lit the ceiling strips into a white panic. The siren found its two-tone throat and began to saw the air in half. Kythor's breath collapsed into a staccato that belonged to a creature hunted in its own skin. Naya didn't bother with the intercom. She caught the siren by the neck with a palm swipe on her belt console and throttled it down to a soft, repeating chime, then drove the lights from surgical noon to the amber of a canyon that had learned dusk. Another blast. Closer. The western service door flared a bright line, as if drawn by a child with an angry crayon. Someone, outside, was cutting thermal lance. Amateur hands. Naya angled herself between Kythor's eyes and the growing light, shaping her body into a shield the size of a human, and letting the melody change shape. It shed its cradle and found a spine. With me, she said into the hum. And the dragon, shaking and very young and trying to make sense of an empire's roar, lowered his crest and leaned into the sound. She keyed the maintenance hatch behind the water basin, the one every budget committee forgot and every janitor knows. The amber tint on the observation glass turned the guards on the mezzanine into polite shadows. One of them shifted as if to object, and then stilled, as if a hand had closed gently on his wrist. Naya swung the hatch and breathed dust that smelled like ductwork and dignities. "Lo," she sang, and Kythor folded as if the word had rolled him down a hill. He was bronze and black and long as a shuttle bus. The shaft was a tunnel that believed in human technicians, not dragons. That only meant mathematics. She counted his breaths into the space, charted his angles against the corners, and solved it with a song that kept his fear from adding wild elsewhere. The first raider through the door met the old dome in its worst mood. A room that had decided it was a machine again. He barked orders into a world that no longer amplified his voice. Goggles throwing back the amber like cheap jewelry, rifle-shouldered, feet already slipping on the thin frost of popped fire-suppressant ice. Naya did not look behind. She took the drone's broken rail, kicked its manual release, and let the whole gantry cascade down into the doorway in a polite avalanche of alloy. The raider swore. The thermal lance squealed and guttered. Someone out there announced, too loud, that they were taking the asset. It made Kythor's ribcage try to sprint. Naya countered with a triplet the rhythm miners used when ladders were iced and hands had to remember. Hands, and kept him moving. The shaft kinked and narrowed to the footings of the dome, then shouldered into an equipment corridor where pipes had been taught to mind their lanes. To a dragon, it was a throat. To Naya, it was a godsend. She flung a roll of thermal blanket ahead to pad the elbow in the bend and coaxed Kythor's body around it with touch and tone. The foam sealant from her belt hissed across a seam where one wing membrane had snagged. She smoothed it with 2 fingers and a bar of melody that would have been a lullaby if it hadn't been marching. Steel screamed somewhere behind saws, finally learning their task, and the world changed key. Naya slapped a palm to a maintenance panel marked with the sort of warning label that makes bureaucrats feel tall, ripped the cover off, and hot-wired the fire dampers. The corridor sighed as every vent door closed at once like eyelids. Overpressure valves dumped into the raiders' entry point, and white mist boiled into their faces with the offended breath of a building surprised to find it had lungs. The men coughed. Someone fired a blind shot. The round sparked off the bulkhead and went skidding into the vast nowhere of bad ideas. "Right," Naya sang. And Kythor, no longer a figure in a nightmare, just a body inside a map, followed the vowel. He skidded once, claws scraping the yellow hazard stripes on the deck, then corrected himself and kept his head low the way she'd taught him when drones hissed. She shepherded him past a machine room where boilers told each other stories, and into the freight lift lobby where the air smelled like rubber and floor polish, and the old penny's scent of withheld blood. The lift called its car up the shaft with the patience of an aging butler. The button panel blinked silly elevator language. Naya spoke janitor instead, punched the maintenance override, and used a code that had been meant for bringing mop buckets to gala floors without scuffing the guests. The doors parted. The car's floor groaned when Kythor set his foreclaws. The cab, built for pallets and pride, discovered purpose. "With me," she told him again, and he crowded in until the bronze plate of his shoulder was warm against her hip. The doors slid. A figure appeared at the end of the lobby, the lead raider. Visor up now, eyes sharp and wrong, suit glossy with rented confidence. He raised a weapon whose barrel had been drilled to look expensive. Naya did not give him a syllable. She pressed the foam charge to the floor, grate outside the lift with a palm smack that was part prayer, keyed it with her thumb, and let the microcharge belch dust into the man's face with the precise fury of an insult delivered in his first language. He flinched. The doors kissed shut. The car fell. Through the jolt, through the groan of guides and the complaint of old cable, she kept the note on one line and let Kythor borrow it as a spine. His breath tried to run. She set the tempo with 2 fingers on his jaw. He found it, stumbled, found it again. When the lift banged into the locking dogs of the command level, the dragon was shaking but whole, and the song had mercifully outlived the siren. On the mezzanine, shadow moved at last. The tall man turned and vanished from the amber blur with the soft violence of someone who has remembered he commands storms. The doors opened onto a corridor that believed it was a border. Polished stone that wanted to be a mirror. Banners that had learned to hang heavy. Sconces that threw light like the edges of accustomed knives. Security shutters had already dropped at the far end, teeth interlocking with the satisfaction of an animal settling back into its old jaw. Between Naya and the gates lay 10 meters of floor and a handful of men who had decided their orders were clear. Behind Naya stood a dragon who had not learned yet that he could be brave without breaking. "Lo," she said, and dropped to a crouch without tearing the road. Melody. Kythor, king of nothing yet, heir to everything, later flattened until his belly kissed stone. Left, she sang on a glide, and he slid with her, so that when the first burst of gunfire stitched blind along the center line, it stitched only marble. The rounds ricocheted inferred, shocked pings as if embarrassed to be here. Naya's consonants became commands. "Hold," she breathed into the vowel. And Kythor held. A coil shut, but listening. A guard's baton clattered across the floor as a raider tried to muzzle a door's last complaint. Another man raised a cutting lance and found the wind going the wrong way. The building's dampers, still sulking from Naya's interference, exhaled across the corridor and blew the flame out like a candle being told a story was over. A burst of coolant line would make fog. She spotted the seam in the wall, the telltale condensation stripe, and pitched her voice a half-step higher. The tone she had learned opened automatic valves for overnight purge. It was not music, not in any academy sense, but the system had been designed by a tired engineer who liked voice macros, and the panel obeyed. A soft hiss became a white curtain as cold vapor rolled along the floor and up into the indecision hovering in men's knees. The raiders coughed and swore and tried to become taller than physics. Naya touched Kythor's cheekbone and gave him a direction with the smallest tilt of her fingers. "Now," she sang, a word that carried more momentum than a shove. He exhaled not fire but heat, the careful, tempered breath of a being who had been taught in the last hour that power and precision are not enemies. The mist took it gladly, flashed to a blinding steam that filled the hallway and made every infrared sensor useless for 3 beats. Naya used those beats like coins. 3, 2, slide, she sang. And they moved, low and left again, toward the service hatch she'd spotted half a life ago, when she thought she decided, be a woman with keys forever. The hatch's locks didn't care about singing. They cared about nerve. She jimmied the cover with the edge of her ID, slotted 2 fingers into the dial, and found the bite, the tiny catch that meant the factory had misaligned something, a millimeter, and every custodian since had learned that you pushed, not pulled. It popped with a sound like a good joke landing. "In," she breathed, and Kythor, trusting the shape of the word now, flowed through the mouth in a pour of bronze and shadow. A raider shed the fog and charged, knife out, saved by ignorance from the worse honesty of a firearm in close quarters. He swung for the human because the human was smaller. Kythor's head snapped not a strike. A parry, and the man's blade skated off the dragon's brow ridge, with the screech of physics learning it had offended an elder. The knife fell. Naya kicked it under a grate with the unceremonious efficiency of a nurse disposing of a needle in the middle of a code. "Down," she told the dragon, palm flat, and he ducked so that the baton that would have wrung his skull kissed air. They spilled into the service gallery, a bright spine of hall where conduits marched in obedient ranks and floor arrows told the world where to go. Naya loved these arteries like old friends. She knew which of them had hiccups and which had heart. "Left ahead, hold," she sang, cadence clean. the color of her voice refusing to panic even as running found their feet. Kythor's wing brushed a pipe labeled with more warning triangles than sense. He tucked the membrane with a practiced grace that felt borrowed from tomorrow. She slapped another smear of sealant on the seam mid-stride, never breaking tempo. And when he stumbled, she put her shoulder to his jaw and let him borrow balance. Behind, a squad found the gallery and tried to reinvent tactics in a hallway. "Stop," a voice commanded. Crisp, city-trained. Used to being obeyed by men who stood still for tiny gods. The word missed Naya entirely. She was listening for different verbs. "Breathe," she told Kythor. "Because in doorways, breath is as important as feet." He gave her 2 good inhales and an exhale that shook out memory like water. And then they were moving again. Not fast, not sloppy, just the steady velocity of a plan that has decided to be true. The gallery ended at a vestibule with a pair of doors that had opinions. The one on the right wore the polite anonymity of public service. The one on the left had no label at all, only a strip of dark metal set flush with the wall, and a sense of self that emanated like heat. Naya would have chosen the right-hand door and earned a staircase full of mistakes. The left-hand door chose for her. It slid aside without complaint, as if a hand Naya could not see had gestured, and the building had skipped the part where it asked who was allowed. The vestibule beyond was wider than need, and cooler than the rest of the floor. A throat leading to the command concourse she had never imagined she'd be invited to see. Security gates at the far end, unlatched in a ripple, like a fish turning under a current. Naya hesitated only long enough to mark the new math. Their path was being cleared by someone with authority to spend doors like coin. "Forward," she said. And Kythor came, shaking, breath holding but not breaking. His eyes on her hand. She kept the song soft now, almost a memory of itself. Because the world had become loud in a different way. Banners too big for whim drifted in conditioned air. The stone under her knees had the polish of history's shoes. A blast deflected somewhere behind security, finally earning its verbs. In the mezzanine above this new throat, shadow moved with purpose. Naya squared her shoulders for whatever would stand at the end of this corridor and decided, a heartbeat too late and exactly on time, that she would not bow to a title before she'd checked on a boy. She set her hand to Kythor's jaw one more time, felt his breath answer yes, and walked him through gates that were supposed to turn smaller people aside. On the balcony ahead, a tall figure in gray stepped into full light for the first time, and the air around the room remembered the word silence, as if it had been waiting to be introduced. The command concourse received them like a cathedral that had remembered it was once a home. Flags whispered in conditioned air. Polished stone kept its cold counsel. At the far end, a line of guards bristled into readiness, and then, as if a single invisible hand lowered every weapon, stood down in unison. The Reason stepped out of shadow. He was taller than holograms make emperors, or perhaps lighter. Power had carved him lean instead of large. The gray coat was unmarked, but gravity gathered around him, the way heat gathers on a foundry floor. He did not unfold titles with his presence. He subtracted them. When his eyes found Kythor, they were not the eyes of the voice that signed orders. They were a father's eyes that had run out of bargains. Naya's body made the decision, before her mind finished writing it. She took half a step in front of Kythor. Not enough to block, just enough to say, "This fear has an advocate." She kept the music low and warm. The way you keep a hand on a railing on a staircase you trust but never entirely. Kythor's foreclaws clicked on stone, paused, and slid forward again until the tip of his crest cleared her shoulder. The muscles under her palm thrummed with the charge that had been misnamed anger all morning. Up close it revealed itself as devotion, with nowhere to go. "Stop," someone whispered. A reflex with a badge. The Emperor lifted 2 fingers, and the word died in the air like a spark in snow. He came on foot, no dais, no flanking trumpets. His stride measured to match the breaths Naya was counting. At 3 meters he did the most indecorous thing a sovereign can do. He knelt. Ceremony fled the room. The guards looked at the far wall, because privacy is its own duty. The Emperor's palms found the floor, bare, unarmed, level with a muzzle that could remove them by misunderstanding. He did not bow his head into the bite. He lifted his face to the boy, throat exposed, the single mammal truth that crosses species without translation. His voice, when it came, was hoarse from years of telling crowds what they needed to hear. It cracked on a syllable that had no witness, but family. Kythor. Naya felt the name land differently. Not the administrative shape stamped on a chart, not the clinical bark that preceded procedures, but a sound that had been practiced in empty rooms, worn smooth on long nights, and never risked in daylight. The dragon's pupils dilated to saucers and then narrowed again, not in threat, in recognition, trying to assemble itself from broken magnets. Every old alarm in his body shouted for a retreat he did not take. The breath Naya had set like a metronome faltered, caught, then chased itself back onto the beat as if embarrassed to be seen. The Emperor did not reach. He did not perform. He let every witness in the hall watch time rearrange his posture. The spine that ceremonies had taught to be iron softened by degrees into something that could absorb a shock. His hands, which had pressed seals onto decrees that made continents act, curled on stone, with nothing to command. In the crescent of hum that Naya kept alive between her ribs, a second tone joined, tentative, lower, older. She looked down, startled, and realized the man was matching her count, breath for breath, the way any father would when a baby's chest is a storm. Kythor gave a sound unlike any he had made since the dome. It was small and awful, not built for corridors or crowns. A hatchling noise leaked by a body that had been taught to carry armor instead of asking for arms. The room did not deserve that sound, and yet here it was, gilding the limestone and climbing the banners like a private hymn that had lost its way and found sanctuary. Naya eased her hand from jaw to brow ridge and felt the tremor turn into deliberate stillness under her palm. "That's him," she told the panic playing dead in the walls. "That's the voice behind the glass." The Emperor closed his eyes once, as if something long clenched had finally loosened and might bruise the air with relief. When he opened them, he kept them where they belonged. On the boy, not the court. "I am late," he said, and the sentence carried more history than the Empire's anthem. "I am here now." There was a commotion at the concourse door, late alarms catching up to the raid, boots clapping their own importance. Then an abrupt silence, edges sanded down by a gesture Naya couldn't see. Power had chosen its priority, and it wasn't spectacle. She shortened the phrase again. 2 in, 2 out. The Emperor mirrored without flourish. Kythor's chest tried to sprint on the exhale and, with 2 sets of lungs flanking the rhythm, slowed. Naya slid her palm away and let space exist between dragon and man, a corridor where neither fear nor protocol walked first. Kythor bridged it. He lowered his head very slowly, as if the world might punish earnestness, and touched his brow to the stone in front of the Emperor's knee. The gesture was older than banners. The sound the Emperor made in answer was younger than dignity. When his hand finally rose, it found the scales above the eye, the safe place Naya had taught with her fingers, and rested there feather-light. The dragon didn't flinch. "Your Majesty," a security captain tried again, aiming at necessity. Naya kept the melody running like a current under someone else's speech. The Emperor did not look away. "Hold," he said, and the single syllable inverted the chain of command from the ground up. The captain swallowed orders that had been halfway to his teeth. For the first time since the blasts, the room made no demands at all. Truth, when it finally arrives, often asks for a smaller room. They took one without windows off the concourse, all soft edges and quiet vents. The sort of chamber built for treaty signatures that turn to bedtime, because children exist in palaces terrible at remembering them. The guards stayed as shadows in the seam of the door. Naya stood at Kythor's shoulder and kept the hum in her chest like a small hearth you don't let go cold when weather is thinking about returning. The Emperor remained kneeling on the carpet until the dragon's breath lost the last of its hitch. Then he folded into a sit with the care of a man whose bones had been trained by parade armor and were surprised to be asked for gentleness. Up close, the gray coat showed wear at the cuff, where a thumb had worried the fabric for years. He looked at Naya at last. "Corin," he said, making her name a respectful address instead of a personnel file entry. "I'm afraid you met my son like this." The title landed without fanfare because Naya's head was already nodding. She'd known since the first gates opened for a janitor's codes. Still, hearing the word bent the room's axis. She did not kneel. She dimmed the lights 2 degrees and tipped her chin, as if to a parent in a clinic corridor, at 3 a.m. "He met me on a hard day," she said. "Hard days make good beginnings, if you don't lie to them." Veldron's mouth tugged once, a straight line bending toward a human shape. He set one palm open on the carpet where Kythor could see it, and, managing not to tremble, left it there. "They told me song was sentimental," he said. "They told me exposure therapy would teach him to sit through alarms without needing anyone." He did not spit the word anyone like a slur. He let it be what it was, the only remedy the palace had never prescribed. They weren't wrong about exposure. Naya allowed. They were wrong about what he should be exposed to first. She angled the bowl she'd carried from the dome until thin ripples shivered the water's skin. "We gave him flood. He needed rain." The Emperor's eyes tracked the line of the ripples, and Naya watched him notice that they dampened at the same pace as the muscle at the hinge of Kathor's jaw. He looked like a man who had just been shown the answer to a riddle he had been punishing himself with for a decade. "Pirates burned a clutch to make me look away," he said. Voice level, the way only practiced grief is. "I paid, and they sold me a single egg anyway, because that's how men like that stay alive. I built a nursery in a fortress. It smelled like fear and bleach." He hatched to applause through glass. Kythor made a low sound that could have been agreement or indigestion. To Naya's ear it was both. She gave the hum a new contour, a valley instead of a straight road, and felt the dragon's breath. "Follow the terrain. He has associations welded into his nervous system," she said, keeping any indictment out of her tone. "We can cut and re-weld, but the first new seams have to hold." She nodded at the Emperor's hand, still open on the carpet. "That's a good seam." Veldron looked at his hand as if it belonged to someone else. He closed his fingers, opened them again. "I could have visited more," he said simply. No justification. No calendar blown at like dust. "I told myself the experts knew how to make him strong. I forgot what kind of strength a boy needs to learn before he learns the other kind." "Instruction teaches compliance," Naya said. "Presence teaches safety. Safety lets you learn anything." She set her palm on the back of Kathor's neck and felt the small flinch that said a memory had arisen, and left, without making trouble. "If you want to help, breathe when I do." He smiled at that. Not the court-curated upward turn the lave, news feeds captured, but a brief, shy look that hit Naya somewhere she had not armored since childhood. "An order I can follow," he said, and he did. Inhale when she did, exhale on her cadence. After a count, she took her hand away and let his presence carry the beat. Kythor's ribcage hesitated, listened, and then miracle in a small room matched his father without borrowing Naya's scaffolding. The ventilation hiss crept up a notch, as if the building had opinions about being excluded. Naya ratcheted it down again, without looking. She hated how quickly she had learned the palace's bad habits. She loved how the room obeyed a caretaker's hand as readily as it did a sovereign's. "Security will ask to move him," Veldron said after a time, as if rehearsing the argument for an audience that would mistake compassion for indulgence. "They will say this chamber is a vulnerability. Then we rebuild the other room until it behaves," Naya said. Amber. Light. On a slow ramp. Fans under the comfort threshold. Filters that smell like basalt and not like making examples. Drones off their rails, until I say otherwise. And a person, not a protocol. Preferably two, so nobody has to be a saint. One of the shadows by the door coughed into his sleeve. The kind of cough that disguises a laugh as dust. Veldran didn't turn, but a corner of his mouth lifted in permission. "Name who you need," he said. "Hire anyone who can hum." "Humans," Naya said, glancing at him deliberately to measure what the word did to his face. "Not because we're magic, but because voice carries differently in our throats. Alien choirs, too, if they can hold a tone without knives in it. And teach your guards to count with us instead of shouting at clocks." "Done." He said it as if he were signing a grain tariff. Naya felt the machinery of an empire redeploy around a lullaby, and had to sit with it a second because women in soft shoes are not supposed to move armies. She swallowed the start of a laugh and kept singing instead. Cathor's eyes had been on their mouths the entire time. Learning the map of sound to meaning the way children do when words become trustworthy. He blinked once, slow and thoughtful, and bumped his brow into Veldran's open hand with such care. Naya wanted to invent a new medal for it. The Emperor's shoulders lost another year. He leaned forward until their foreheads touched and stayed there, not in the stiff palace salute of equals, but in the clumsy blessing of kin who have been late and have decided to start anyway. A chime in the corridor tried to revive decorum. The door's seam brightened with a deferential glow. Naya didn't go. She rested her back against Cathor's flank and felt warmth seep into the bruise his tail had given her, a little closed circle of justice. "We should teach the staff a phrase," she said after a while, talking like people do when night and morning share a table. Something to say before they touch him. A two-note greeting that means, "I am here, and I am not a blade." Make it policy. Put it on posters. Put it on pay stubs. Let it be the first thing every door learns to say to everybody. Veldran nodded as if presented with troop dispositions. "We will," he said. And there was no royal we in it. There was a father, and a woman with a song, deciding a building's new religion. Outside, somewhere deep in the palace guts, technicians finished welding, shut the ragged hole raiders had made, sparks hissing in water as the wound sealed. In the quiet room, Naya let the hum resolve into nothing more than breathing. The Emperor matched her once, then twice, and then, without instruction, began to carry the count himself, while she had the audacity to do the most subversive thing available to her. She rested. They moved the training to the war room because the war room owned the palace's loudest clocks. Maps glowed across the table like patient constellations. A wall of alert panels, weighted with the vulture hum of machines that enjoy their own importance. Naya stood between two holoprojectors and tuned the room as if it were an instrument, long stored and a little ashamed. Lights down to honest amber. Vents under the comfort line. Status chimes softened until urgency could whisper without screaming. Veldran took his place, not at the head, but at Cathor's flank. Sleeves pushed to the forearms. The imperial version of rolling them up. "On my count," Naya said, and the Emperor nodded as if she were the only general that mattered. The first alarm she cued was the polite one, a soft tritone, meant to remind a staffer to wash hands. Cathor's pupils pinched, then recovered. His breath hitched on the second beat and slid back into Naya's measure. "Good," she murmured, as much to the room as to the dragon, and bumped the dial. The second alarm was the corridor drill, brighter, faster, the sound of orderly, shoes turning corners. Cathor's tail lifted from the floor like a question. Naya laid her palm to the hinge of his jaw. Veldran matched her inhale, then her exhale, and the tail settled, as if it had chosen its answer. They built up the noise the way a mason lays courses. The fire suppressant test hissed. The warning lights strobed on a slow ramp instead of a slap. When the first sharp, old siren arrived, the one that had woken every nerve in him since hatching, he flinched hard enough to rattle the table's edge. Naya did not soothe. She counted. Vaildren's hand stayed open, and still on the carpet, where Cathor could see it. A father is a kind of metronome when he decides to be. The dragon's chest scrambled, failed, scrambled again, then landed on their rhythm with the bewildered relief of a runner finding a downhill. A captain from security leaned into the doorway, curiosity uncamouflaged, and stayed when no one ordered him away. Others drifted in the medchief with pen poised for objections that never arrived, a quartermaster with grease under her nails, a pair of palace choristers who had come to tune lutes and discovered their throats had better work. Naya raised a hand, and the newly minted audience joined the exercise not with hush, but with breath. Inhale when she did, exhale when she fell. A humming eddy in a room built for declarations. It made the siren seem suddenly smaller, a creature whose bark could be taught to share. Midway through the drill, a real warning thread needled the screen reactor coolant pressure, flirting with numbers that make engineers use religion. The room tensed. Cathor tensed with it, feeling the mood before the meaning. Naya flicked the alarm feed to visual only, bought the room 10 seconds of quiet, and threw a look at the chief engineer that meant fix it, or I will start singing in your pipes. The chief vanished at a jog and returned with a thumbs up so sheepish it nearly apologized to the laws of thermodynamics. The panels settled. Cathor watched danger become discussion and learned a new arithmetic. Not every red light belongs to a fire. Again, Naya said, because repetitions bake resilience, and they worked the ladder down. By the end, the siren that had once been a blade was only a bell. He could breathe through it, without looking like the world was ending, and on the third cycle, he even tilted his head toward Vaildren to check if the count still matched. The Emperor laughed short, helpless. The kind that erupts when the body recognizes mercy and then looked startled at himself. Like a man who has found a window in a wall he built. They rehearsed the touch too. Naya guided the Emperor's hand to the ridge above the eye, the safe plateau. She showed him how pressure becomes reassurance, and how removal can be a conversation, rather than a loss. Cathor leaned into that hand with the patience of creatures who have decided to meet you halfway. And for a moment, the war room's maps of contested systems looked embarrassed to be so simple. When they stopped, it was not because the work was finished, but because the lesson had to be allowed to rest. Naya laid out the last trial with a few quiet gestures. They would open the war room doors, and they would let palace noise pour in without editing. And no one would move or command or explain. Presence would do the rest. The guards straightened. The doors parted. A corridor's bustle poured through. Boots, mops, laughter, the hollow clack of a dropped tray, a courier's sprint, the distant purr of drones. Cathor's crests rose, then folded. He inhaled and exhaled on the shared measure, eyes on the two chests that made the rhythm safe. He did not bolt. He did not brace. He did the most imperial thing in the room. He stayed. It had the force of ceremony without the waste of gold. The captain in the doorway saluted with 2 fingers to his throat, the new sign, already migrating into muscle. Memory and the salutes multiplied down the hall, until even a cook carrying a vat of soup tried to hum and sloshed only a little. Vaildren looked at Naya as if a crown had just been repurposed into a doorstop. Write it, he said softly, already legislating through gratitude. All of it. The counts, the light, the greeting, at the door, the salaries for the people who hold the room together with their voices. I will sign until my hand aches. Make the paper thin, Naya said, practical even at the altar. Thick decrees bend slowly. Thin ones spread. He smiled, and the room relaxed into the future as if it had been waiting for permission to be ordinary and kind at the same time. They called it an edict because empires like their verbs ceremonial, but it read like instructions taped to the side of a good machine. Lullaby protocol, the masthead said. And beneath, a series of obligations that sounded deceptively small. Every medbay will maintain a quiet light cycle. Every alert will have a ramp. Every maintenance drone will learn to say, "I am here," in 2 soft tones before it moves. Every staffer in high-noise wings will be trained to count aloud without shouting. Every hatchery, clinic, and engine room will hold at least 2 humans or allies trained in breath cadence support at all shifts. Greeting hands will be shown before touching bodies. There were penalties for breaking it, and rewards for doing it beautifully. More importantly, there were phone numbers. You could call a choir in the middle of the night, and a voice would answer with the word you needed most. Here, implementation looked like chaos at first, because kindness is noisy when it's new. Guards practiced the 2-note greeting in mess lines and discovered that humming keeps arguments from starting. A logistics chief requisitioned privacy film for 300 glass walls and wrote a love letter to the quartermaster who found it. Engineers who had only ever tuned reactors were caught, in the act of tuning vents by ear, crouched on ladders with their heads cocked like birds. In the hatcheries, scaled infants startled by the world's brightness settled faster under amber lamps. A breeder with a scar down her throat sent Naya a thank you scrawled on the back of a filter invoice. And everywhere, posters appeared, with a hand and a throat, and a small set of notes, drawn like a child's first music, captioned with the phrase, "Naya had joked, should be policy," and that Veldran had made so. "I am here, and I am not a blade." There was resistance, of course. A colonel who had never met a lullaby he didn't suspect of treason filed a tart memo about operational erosion. Veldran returned it with 3 annotations. One was a citation from a battle where panic cost more than bullets. 2 was a budget line authorizing additional training for the colonel's regiment in breath cadence drills. 3 was a note in his own hand that read, "If your men can hold rhythm under fire, they will hold formation under anything." The colonel, to his credit, started making his troops hum during live fire. And to his surprise, their grouping tightened. He sent Naya a stiff bottle of something that tasted like burned sugar and apology. Naya hired ruthlessly and kindly. The way you stock an ICU with nurses who can stare down death until it looks away. Singers from minor choirs. Technicians with perfect pitch and grease under their nails. An elderly janitor who had calmed half a generation of palace brats with a story about a stubborn broom. A shy xenobiologist who could tune a vent by feeling it in her ribs. She paired them with guards who had learned to leave their swagger at the door, and with medics who had learned that silence is not the same as peace. She handed out badges that said hum in neat letters and meant you were allowed to contradict a siren with your mouth. Cathor's world enlarged to meet the policy he had inspired. He tested the thresholds of rooms under 24. Naya's supervision, the way you test ice, one careful foot, then another, then the leap that proves a day. Alarms came and went, and found him breathing on purpose. Which is a kind of monarchy no crown can counterfeit. He learned the 2-note greeting and returned it, a soft interval that made cooks grin and bureaucrats blink tears away in the pretense of dust. He walked the balcony of the concourse with Veldran at his side, not as spectacle but as practice. And when a sudden cheer went up from a cluster of clerks who had heard the story and couldn't help themselves, he pressed his head to the emperor's shoulder and chose to stay instead of bolt. That choice became a portrait hung in 10,000 minds. On the day the edict went palace-wide, Veldran signed the last copy in a room full of ordinary noise, footsteps, pens scratching, a kettle's agreeable sigh. He wrote his name with a hand that had spent years signing orders taut with loss. Today the pressure eased and the letters looked almost like someone else's. He handed the stylus, not to a minister, but to Naya, for the final countersign, and the cameras that had gathered to devour ceremony recorded the indecorous truth: an emperor and a caretaker and a dragon standing in a triangle that felt like architecture rediscovered, not politics performed. "Last test," Naya said, "practical to the end. Because endings are just rooms that will be needed again." She keyed the palace-wide alarm to a slow ramp. Lights softened, then brightened like dawn deciding itself. The first tone came low and human. Across the complex, people lifted their heads, breathed together, and returned the greeting. In the command concourse, Cathor's chest rose and fell with the measure he had made his own. Vaildren matched him without looking. The old siren tried to climb and failed. Not because policy forbade it, but because thousands of throats made a better weather. When the chime ended, the silence that followed did not feel like absence. It felt like a room, waiting for the next good noise. Naya put her hand to the hinge of Cathor's jaw, and he leaned, and the weight of it told her all the audits had been satisfied, without a single form. She looked up at Vaildran, who had learned to breathe without coaching, and thought of the first time she had turned off an intercom to sing to Rock. "We've tuned the palace," she said, unable to keep the grin from her mouth. "Now we see if the galaxy can learn a key." Vaildren's answering smile was half father, half sovereign. "Make me a list," he said. "Not of enemies this time, but of rooms in distant stations where alarms still believed they could shout children into courage. We'll start with the ones we've neglected. We'll end where there are no ends." Cathor bumped them both with the soft, ceremonial thud the old clans used before battle and bedtime. The war room screens slept. The vents breathed like a living lung. Through stone and banner and glass, a new grammar traveled. 2 notes at every threshold. An empire clearing its throat to say, "I am here."